This is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit hosted by the Kiloby Center for Recovery. And I'm delighted to be here today with Akilah Richards. She is someone who might not necessarily come to mind when I first think about recovery and addiction, but she does a lot of deep work on conditioning and unschooling. So she is passionate about mindful partnerships and conscious parenting and using unschooling as a healing grounds and liberation work for Black, non-Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. She has a celebrated unschooling podcast, Fare of the Free Child. And she has a book, Raising Free People, Unschooling as Liberation and Healing Work from PM Press. So welcome.
Thank
And let's take off from here. So I've invited you to be on this summit about recovery and addiction. And let's talk about how your work fits into that.
Yeah, totally. As we were chatting a little bit before, Lynn, that um, really it makes sense to me that recovery and the process of that and the journey of that would connect us because as someone who is constantly unschooling and deschooling, and we can talk a little bit about what that means for me, but constantly in and out of those states of unschooling and deschooling, there's so much recovery of self and recovering from things, that of and that from, that ebb and that flow and all the in betweens. It's such an inherent part of an unschooling journey that we often the journey of unschooling intersects with so many different elements of the ways that we find ourselves, like the ways we find ourselves and the conditions in which we find ourselves. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. So, unschooling has something to do with freedom and conditioning and deprogramming. So, why don't we start with just tell us a little bit about your work? What
Hmm.
do you do?
Yeah, so unschooling is a label, so
Hmm.
it has that limitation. uh but I like it. I like that label because that process of unschooling accurately describes or begins to describe how my life changed, and then the lives of my partner Chris and Marley and Sage, who are our daughters. They're 16 and 14
Hmm.
right now. And the process for us began with disentangling them from school. And then because they wanted that. So they were in elementary school, and we had worked really hard to get into that school and be in that neighborhood and all the checklist things, and at the cost of many things, because in the US South, as in many places, good school, good neighborhood means predominantly white, which means dominant cultural norms, which means diminishing of generally marginalized groups, particularly Black people.
Hmm.
So those elements come at a cost that, particularly for me as somebody who migrated to the US from Jamaica, had very specific ideas about what it would cost me culturally to attain the American dream. And and then because of that grooming, applying that to my children, like that's just how that works, right?
Right.
No mindfulness around it, let alone their consent, which is a major part of unschooling. So they were in school and everything was fine, but we noticed that emotionally they were becoming different, and not different in that, yeah, you're going to be different than you were at 2, 3, and 4. Now that you're 5, 6, 7, different like this.
Uh,
Marley, who was how we knew her, was a very like inquisitive, assertive, like, how come this? And I don't know if I like that. And she was like that. And after in during that first year, she then became more of like, is it okay to ask this question? Or
mm,
how does someone else feel about me asking the question? And not in a way of being considerate, but in a way of comparing or being afraid to be herself, or why can't the other kids do these things, or how come the adults like me more? Oh, am I better? Are they? She was navigating that at 6 and 7, and
Mm,
was somehow able to consistently articulate her needs and her concerns with her environment to Chris and to me enough times that we were like, oh, okay, maybe we can't there hun her that 18th time.
right. Yeah.
Maybe it matters whether we're listening to her, even if we're not even sure that what she's saying is relevant, or maybe it's good that she's struggling. That's how you get strong. That's what school is for.
Right.
Those things became first questionable, and then certainly not true. And we we withdrew Marley and Sage from school, and that's when our own unraveling began in our recovery process of rehumanizing our relationships and not so much looking at our children as students,
Right.
first graders, second graders, but as people, to whom we could model and learn from and practice partnership, as opposed to what we were groomed in, which is a very like comparison based, production driven, ambition and charisma up top, and everything else trying to get to that or
Yeah.
not trying, so that's kind of where how that started. And so that really just became my work. I'm a writer, and so I write about my life experiences,
Mm,
and I'm a digital person in some ways, not in terms of tech as you've experienced, but in terms of being able to have a feeling and a thought and reach out to other people and gather that and work that, and then allow that to work us. So then I might do a podcast or create a course or gather a group. And that's what I do around unschooling and all of the things that come with that decision. And I call that raising free people, because it includes ourselves.
wow. There's so much there that I'd like to go deeper into. So, one thing is, it's heartbreaking to watch the lights being dimmed in children. And I really saw that at the beginning of COVID in March last year. I have three grandchildren, one of whom did well, wanted to go to school, was okay without school, the oldest, the girl. But my two grandsons, who are 12 and 14, loved being at home. They loved not having to be at school. And, as we go deeper into that, sometimes we really see how much pressure there is, how much peer pressure, bullying, having to stay still in a classroom. One has a big personality, which often would get him into trouble. And and I could just really see the grooming part of this and the fitting children into this narrow confines.
Yes, and it is sad to see it, and it also, we we have this way as adults where we both romanticize childhood and
Mhm.
colonize it at the same time. In that, of course, we think children should be able to, hey, speaking of, children should be able to be themselves, and frolic is the term that I think about, like that's childhood should include frolicking,
Yeah,
and we think that and we believe that we protect that. Yet there are entire youth rights organizations that are comprised of human beings under the age of 20 who are saying, hey, there are specific needs and rights that we have that are, you being in power are in the way of that, and we are petitioning and pushing and demanding. So if that thing was something that we did actually value, would it need to petition the way my children did for me to say, oh, what you're saying could be relevant? And to get from that to how could it not be, if I'm saying that all the reasons that you mentioned, how they dim, that light gets dimmed, and we compare and all of these things, it doesn't end in childhood,
right.
because we know anybody watching this can relate to either directly or someone close to you what we call in unschooling school wounds.
Uh,
WOUNDS. You know, the things that happened to us in childhood as a result of the adults, the people in power, their focus on our studenthood, like over our something that we needed emotionally, you know, safety wise, consent wise. All of those things, they don't just end when it's like, all right, you're out of grade school, boom, now keep your emotional wellness, get it intact, you got 2 years ago.
yeah,
No,
right,
all of those ways that you have been viewed through the lens of your capacity to produce in the confines of studenthood then follow you into your beliefs about yourself, into your views of other people. And so there you find, just like things like recovery, you find that people who begin to question that and deconstruct that are also people who are doing that in other areas of their lives, because you recognize that if you're doing it in relationships with children,
mm,
wherever you go, there you are. You're
right,
taking that approach to other things, or there's a dissonance there. So your social justice lens is informed by your parenting or how you relate to children, and you didn't even know. And now that you know, you get to do that work.
right, right. So what did that look like then for you? Did you start homeschooling?
At first, yeah. So
Yeah,
I talk about that a lot in the book, where we definitely went from school to school at home. It's like, well, you still got to learn, because that's how we thought learning happened. Like most of us do, because that's what we're groomed in. So we started doing school at home, and we were able to, in doing that, by that time I was at home working from home full time.
mhm,
I was also a realtor, so sort of at home, that I'm mixing my schedule up with Chris. And Chris was working still in corporate America and then eventually transitioned out. But at first it looked like school at home. But then as we started to spend more time at home together, since they weren't gone from 7 to 3, we started to recognize that there were ways that they were learning stuff that we didn't even think about, like as a means of how they would learn. So for example, we Sage wasn't big on doing the math workbooks, and we first were like, okay, we won't push it as much, but she liked to bake. And so she was doing fractions, you know, because we were still thinking in terms of school subjects, and we were like, here's how she gets her math in. When
right,
we will make sure that she has the recipe and has to convert it. So we were still like simulating environments of learning. So that's what it looked like at first. And then we would slack off on that from time to time because life, and then they would still be learning stuff. And we're like,
mm,
so so it was really a lot of that, Lynn, where it was like, okay, then there was pushback. Like I tell the story in the book about Marley and the beach, where we were saying, okay, we're going to go to the beach because we were starting to go to Jamaica, and because we could afford to go, because we didn't need to go during the same time that everyone else was off. We could just go in the middle of April. So we did that, and it was like, oh, so now that we're not tied to school, we could like travel and not have to like be millionaires, because that's what we thought before. That's
mhm,
the only way we could travel. So
mhm,
we would go, and then we just started spending a little bit more time in Jamaica, where we're from, because it's really inexpensive to be there. We would stay with family and all of that, and then we'd say, okay, my mom shipped the books. We enrolled them in a virtual academy, and my mom shipped the books to Jamaica because we were there for 6 weeks. and
mhm.
and Marley, and we're like, okay, so we're going to go to the beach, and then we're going to bring the textbook. So you will be able to talk about science, and we'll look at the seashells. And she was like, yes, everything except for the textbook part. And we're like, no, no, no. And so she pushed enough that once again, just like with school, we were like, okay, fine, don't learn anything. We'll just give it a month or so, and we'll take some time off. And that was 2012. We've never come back from that month off.
That's awesome. And I'm pretty sure she's learned a lot since 2012.
As it turns out, you know, like both girls are just First of all, they're not anomalies. Like, we know so many other unschooling families because we have been nomadic right up until COVID. So we've lived in, I think the last count was like 42 cities across maybe 6 or 7 countries since then, like, long stints, short stints. And we've been in community with so many unschoolers. And it's a very similar thing that their children or our children are, it's what you're witnessing is it's what happens when people don't have the confines of what we think learning looks like, and that they get to be immersive and collaborative, and they get to butt up against boundaries so that they develop language and practice for really humane, efficient processes. Like agile learning, the things that people are discovering now, a lot of that is in youth organic organizing, when adults are not colonizing the space with our ideas of who they should be or what the outcome might look like. So that is what essentially unschooling allows, for that type of level of observation and mad question asking, as I call it, about what you thought the process of learning actually looked like, and how much you can involve the actual learner in
Right.
their process.
And to trust that they want to learn.
Yes, because it is just bonkers to think that a human wouldn't want to move past sitting where you put them to sit. At no stage in our development outside of the mother do we just sit, no matter what. No
Mhm.
matter what our ability is, there is movement and motion and desire and drive, and we learn how to do all of these things. And when we're in an environment where like those basic things are considered, like humans are talking and walking and feeding you, you learn the tools of society. So unschoolers learn how to read because you kind of need to learn it for certain things, like gaming, which is how many unschoolers learn how to do it very early on.
Mhm.
um, or whatever it is that they're interested in. Like, the tools of society have always through humanity been adopted by youth and then made better.
Right.
So it's trusting that. Yeah.
But really fundamental to human nature. Right. So I
And that's
can't
the
help as you're
recovery part.
yeah, and as you're talking, I'm thinking about how bored I was in school. We look at that and we see that glazed look on people's faces, and we think maybe that people aren't interested in learning. And it really fits in with this whole aggressive kind of push. I need to push myself to be better. I need
Yeah.
to, and then we visit that on the children as well. But
Yes.
maybe maybe the environment, there's something wrong with the environment.
Right. It's not that the people, if we constantly need the people to do, show up differently in order for the thing to work, is it the people or is it the thing?
Yeah.
And with unschooling, I want to really presence the reality that it isn't about anti-school.
Mhm.
Isn't. For me personally, I try to make this distinction as often as possible and as publicly. I am anti-school. I am.
Mhm.
Unschooling is not anti-school.
Okay.
It is pro consent based living and learning communication. It is trusting a learning process to emerge, and understanding as adults how to facilitate learning without using the dogma that we swim in and that we learn from school. And I call all of that schoolishness. We try to remove from schoolish to self-directed, which may not mean unschooling the way that I do it, but
Right.
self-directedness, the broader umbrella, is about consent and partnership in learning, which then necessitates that you're communicating differently, that it's not a power over thing.
Right.
So that's the distinction that I feel is really important, because this isn't like a everyone needs to be unschooling, but it is absolutely how much consent can you allow, and how much can you observe when that's happening, because that's actually going to shift you and have you see how your own issues with your sense of how much you produce and whether or not that's valuable, how much that affects you, and then in turn the lens through which you treat that child and the other person that you work with at your job or the person you're organizing with. It's not only over here, it's in you. So the work is a beautiful unraveling of the things that colonize us and then in turn cause us to participate in that using those same tools of oppression. Yeah,
Right. So, can you talk a little bit about how you were transformed by this process?
absolutely. Um, well, one was this ongoing or is this ongoing discovery and just awe, AWE, awe around how learning happens and how everywhere it is.
Mhm.
How much my schooled mind, having gone to, K through 12 and university and doing very well, checking off all the studenthood boxes, what that costs me and how much I'm learning now as I put aside the performative version of myself. So, one big change is that it changed my relationship with my mother. For many years of my life, my mother was a space to create distance between. And then as I rehumanized myself and her, very much through my relationship with my daughters and what I was learning by being in community with them instead of power over, then allowed me to see her differently and for her to receive me differently and to witness what's happening with me and my daughters and how I was shifting from a mom who would hit her children to a mom who would never ever considered that and knows where that came from and now supports other people in recognizing why that isn't about a responsible parenting thing, but actually more about how we were colonized and how we view power and wield power and fear, particularly for Black people when our bodies, have been such a site of violence that we want to give our children the little bit because if they at least get it from us, then it's better than what happens out there. I talk about these things because I lived it. And it then gives us the chance to really be like, yeah, let me really feel that through for myself, not from the history of what happened to me, but what I'm moving towards. So, those are some of the shifts that have happened for me personally and
Mhm.
created so much community and conversation and change around our intergenerational relationships.
Wow. Yeah. There's so many things about trauma and disconnection that are coming to mind.
Mm,
How profoundly people are disconnected from themselves, from each other in the parenting process, parents and children. And we just don't feel like we're seen and known. And what you're talking about is so hopeful because there's such a connection there when we stop trying to dominate somebody else. And possibly we could have a really different relationship.
yes, I would say it's more than possibly. I would say you can't not. Because when it really is a chance to slow down, right?
Mhm.
To just slow down a little bit out of all of the performance and all of the ideas of the should and the would and all of the vices that we've built up that maybe were really useful at a stage in our journey, but we didn't do that process of letting go of the parts that are like, oh, I don't live in that house anymore. So I don't actually need to show up in this way to everybody anymore because everybody ain't them. Who am I outside of my situation? Many of us don't even have the space to do that. So when we talk about raising free people, it is very much recovery because that's what you say. Like, what is it that I'm learning or discovering about the world before I can even get to this question of who am I? Because we treat that like a question like everybody's just excited to answer when we don't always even know what that means outside of the things that we've survived.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So kind of defining ourselves by what we've made it through, but that shuts down that whole possibility of who we could be.
Exactly. And we don't have to do it alone because when it comes to our intergenerational relationships in whichever direction, there is such an opportunity to partner with the people in our lives as they are also becoming, so that you don't have to show up. That's another big transformation for me, Lynn. I stopped needing to be the knower of the things. Like that was my position in my family as a child. That was my position in, studenthood. That's why I was president of everything and doing all the things and was getting ready to go to law school. And I was the knower of the things. My everything depended on it. When we began to unschool and recognize that I didn't need to be the teacher, I didn't need to replace that system. I needed to allow, and I needed to allow for things to emerge and participate, being informed by the feedback that I can now invite from less of a space of defending my trauma and more so like, oh, word, that's how you see that? I didn't even know, you know? It
Right.
just changes the game. And it's in all my relationships, all of them, literally.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. So, the topic of fear, there's so much fear and polarization right now, especially. And it's COVID, it's social justice, it's the position of Black people and BIPOC people in our culture. There's all of that that's just causing this huge distress when people feel like there's such a divide. And sometimes it feels like so impossible to actually connect with each other as humans. What would you say about that?
Love that question. I love that question. Lean into it is what I would say. Like, let it distort us. We don't need the thing is not to go to that schoolish space of, well, then how do we find this solution here? Let's put this up on the board, Lynn.
Right.
No, no, it is emergent. It is something that we will allow, not something we will figure out. Like the figuring out is in being in it, to say, oh my God, so now my neighbor, has up this sign and now I have to face this reality. Of course, we want to just do the thing where it's like, oh, but I don't care, but they're so nice and we play cards together and I freaking like them. This is weird.
Yeah.
Now we get to be real together to say, okay, then maybe the first step is distance. Maybe I don't talk to them for a little bit and I see how that feels in my body. And then maybe I get to a point where I say, look, I don't know how to move past this. And for now, it just, so we rehumanize as opposed to, again, the performance. Hey, oh my God, I can't. Right. Like we get to be with, it's not going to be perfect, but I think that is the opportunity to, to move away from what's been normal, even the parts that felt like it was a good normal because it cost somebody something,
Yeah.
right? A lot of our normals cost somebody else something. So
Yeah.
now we get to be with that. So I think as much as there's also the feeling of, oh my God, what to do, there's also very much in a lot of my circles the feelings of, okay, now we can talk. Now you can hear me. Now I matter. You matter too. And but now you get it. Now you get that it's not this. You know what I mean? Like a disruptor's ear is what my friend Malika and I have been talking about it as. There's a disruptor's ear that's developing now that we can say, mm-mm, I hear you different. This is not acceptable, period. And it is your job to understand why. Or
Right.
here is where I am willing to offer something. And I'm not, and I'm talking about race. I'm talking about all of the other isms as well. They're connected.
Yes. Yeah. They are. Yeah. And when we're coming from this knowing of ourselves and each other as humans, then there's a lot more opportunity there to say the truth and to be real. And the connections that we have then are more genuine. They're not
Exactly.
performative, as you were saying.
Yes, real feedback. The
Yeah.
real feedback. It's important. It's hard. It's tricky. It's what we do in our self directed education communities all the time. Get together in these groups, people from all over the world who do the work and feel through, again, language and practice for like, oh, so it's not going to be, my power isn't going to be that my kid is the smartest kid or that I have the most money or that I'm white or that I'm this or that. Now what do we do together?
right.
Can we welcome that? Because it isn't just about being ourselves and being human, it's also about receiving feedback in a way that's like, okay, yes, I don't know why this feels really bad, but I can hear it.
Yeah,
That that part.
right.
That
Yeah. That's such a journey to get to that point where people are willing to even try to hear it, though.
Yeah, and that's the process. It's not about the journey to get to that point. It's about the journey.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, because all of it are the little points. All of the little points matter.
Right. Yeah. So one thing that comes to mind and my own I'm Canadian, so I'm a little bit distant from the US politics, but of course none of us are
Right.
because what you do in the United States affects everybody. But also, as a lesbian, I don't I find it hard to really lean in with people who would vote against my human rights. And so how do you work with that? What would you say
I
about that?
love I love that you bring up that because for me, the leaning in does not mean leaning in to what you said, like to the people who are would vote again. It's leaning into the discomfort and saying, what does that mean for me? So for you, that might mean that you're more deliberate about the conversations that you're having publicly to stretch however you can. It isn't about a martyrdom or your boundaries being irrelevant at all. That's harmful. So liberation work looks like a whole lot of different things to different people. So by leaning into it, you find your lane because your lane doesn't mean that you're going to be in your comfort zone. It doesn't necessarily mean that. So for me, for example, it doesn't mean that I'm raising cohorts to teach white women how to be more humane, but some of my sisters are doing that. That's great because that's what they feel called to do and they can hold that space in a way that is like trustful and trustworthy and it's working. But I know what I can do. And so how do I amplify that? Am I making sure that I'm having conversations that cross over from just talking about education like ours?
Right.
Powerful opportunity for us to share among our audiences and our circles.
Mhm.
This is how we do that. Normally, I might say, no, I don't, it doesn't feel connected, and there's so much work to be done directly where in the communities where I show up. So, and this necessitated something different. This is a leaning in. So,
Yes.
this is an
Yeah.
example of what it might look like. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, I just keep coming back to this connection. So if we think about your daughters and other children that are being raised without this kind of coercion, without being colonized into this system, then that's not going to be I would hope that that's not going to be such a hard thing because they have people around them that are going, I see you, you're a human being, you have my respect, my attention.
And I'm doing my own work too.
Yeah,
That part, yes. It's like exactly that. Like, if we can have more and more spaces where that's happening, where we as adults or we as cishet people or we as, able bodied, like all of those different ways, if we can see and hear while we are doing our own recovery work,
right,
that's just going to make it so that the communication is actually coming through as opposed to meeting all of the things that we haven't worked through yet before we can hear. But it's not that we can't hear and work through it in the meantime. That's why for me raising free people work is so important. It isn't like when you get there you'll know because you won't ever have these problems with such and such. No, it's tools for the journey.
right. Yeah. Hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the unschooling work and raising free children. You mentioned meeting with people from all over the world. What's this movement like, and how do you see this in the next 5 years, 10 years, as some of these children are adults and and
Yeah.
free people?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess because I spend a lot of time with what's happening for children now and the history of what has happened. And I also know that for me as an adult who I'm constantly deschooling, it feels a little maybe I'm not quite ready for yet the future tripping, like looking too far ahead, because then I could get right in my bag of like, this is how I see you, baby girl. So this is what it would take for you to get there. So I can't, I know you're into your thing, but you would make such, and you're so much like my aunt who didn't get to, and
Yeah.
like, so I try not to go so much there so I can speak to the now and the movement now, and that it's really beautiful because there are many unschoolers who don't even use that term. They don't identify as that, not necessarily that they're against it, but it is so organic for them, like it was for me. I didn't know that was a term. I was labeled an unschooler, and then I was like, oh yeah, I like it, I get it. But I didn't know that was a thing. We just ended up doing that by moving from schoolishness to more self-directed learning. And
Mhm.
then we realized that it wasn't just about how they learned, it was about how we were in relationship with each other. And then we realized it was actually about power. And then we realized how much consent had to do with power. So then we had to like take away bedtime and these sort of things, because then how could they navigate and develop boundaries around their own needs if we were deciding on the time for them?
Mhm.
So then that informed our frustration with like, yeah, but it's 3 o'clock in the morning. That's insane. Da, 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 da. And
Right.
to think about, and then to have children who are present to say, by the way, don't use insane because that's actually offensive for people. And then you start to have that, so your world opens up, right? Like, so these are the things, this is what is happening among families and communities the world over. For some people it looks like conversations in the home. There are also agile learning centers, which are like unschooling schools, and they're
Mhm.
all over the world as well. You have
Yeah.
Sudbury schools as well, which are democratic schools, so they run on a democratic model with the children having, the power. um, and and then there are all these other things in between where people are just doing intentional natural learning, not alternative ed, because not project based learning, but really self directed. And so those are some of the different ways that it looks. And some people do it through travel, but others do it just locally. And it really is just about how much can we allow and facilitate for groups of young people to define, what their day is structured like, what they're doing, how they're getting there, how they're collaborating, and to what end in some instances.
So, do your children take like some kind of examinations to pass the grade levels? Do
What
you,
grade levels?
so, like, are they going to graduate high school to be able to go on to university, or are they kind of completely on a different?
so so you don't have to graduate high school to go to university, because I learned that recently.
Oh,
um, so that's one thing. And so no, they don't get any grades because they're not in school. And in the US, in different states have different rules about how that works, to be compliant with the state. And I'm in the US South in Georgia, and you register as a homeschooler, and there's a requirement that at least 180 days of learning, and at any time you need to be able to prove that they learn stuff, which is not a problem because they're alive and people learn things. And they don't test for anything. In order to get into college, they would do the same. They would take like a GED, like take a general education test to say you can read, write, and do basic math, which they can, because those are social skills and they practice it in lots of ways. And then they would just study to take the test to get into that college. And they would have a portfolio that includes all of the life experiences that they've had, because they've done so many things, and you put those things together and they test like anyone else, and that's kind of how that works. So we don't know if they're going to go to college. Marley, our oldest, she's pretty interested, so we're looking at those options, but we're also looking at a self-directed course of study option.
yeah.
Sage, our youngest, is not interested in college, so we don't really have conversations about a schooling path. We talk about the person and the interests, and then if school fits into it, then we would talk about it then, but it isn't central.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. What cool environment for the children.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
It
So
also so like, well, what do sometimes it's like, okay, if you want to do, here are your options. It's like, just tell me which one. I don't know your life. I don't, you want me
right.
to go back into control? So we kind of do that dance sometimes.
So what are the downsides of this?
um, Control is easier. It would be so much easier if I could just say to Marley and Sage, do it because I said so. I'm your mom and I know better. I am 43 years old. I know things.
Right.
And they would be like, whether they agreed or not, they would do it. That would be so much easier. So sometimes it feels frustrating to have to, like, be human with them and not treat them like people that I can just wield my power over, because I can, because I know what that results in. So the development work of constantly nurturing an environment where I don't get to just draw on power is, it can
Mhm.
be frustrating. But obviously the rewards are that, me and my daughters are on my podcast all the time. We do workshops together. People see and hear us engage, and we know each other. We trust each other. We argue. We all the things. We have issues with chores and all of the things, but none of it is not that none of it is. All of it is from a very mindful space of the power that I have to, like, determine so much about how they show up in the world, as I have such an influence, and also what I am learning from not drawing on power and manipulation in relationship with people where I could do that, and then also in people in relationship where I can't. So those things outweigh the feeling sometimes where I'm like, I just want them to do what I say, or maybe it would be better if they were a little bit afraid of me. Those things come up in my mind.
Right.
They do. But I
Right.
know that, yeah, so really that's it, because everything else, it makes everything else so much easier because we're humans together and we are comfortable with our boundaries. We practice it all the time. We
Right.
actually say what we think. They don't have to pretend to not be upset. I don't have to pretend to know shit that I don't know. Like,
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
yeah.
My sense is that anybody would love to be around children who are that engaged and alive and curious and not so.
The romanticized part, like in some context, sure. Like Marley was working with a friend of mine who's a college professor who's also an unschooling mom. um, and so she's teaching in college and her kids are not in school. And Marley did a thing with the class. And by the time Marley finished with the class, they were like, you should be teaching these things because we were learning about these things here and here. Where'd you pick this up? And Marley's like, oh, in the anime club that I started, because a lot of my friends are Japanese, because she's fluent in Japanese, because she had all the time she needed to immerse herself in it. And so she also knows a lot about, like, cultural norms and see how they show up over time. And it,
Mhm.
it just blows my mind, the things that they know. So in those contexts, it feels like, wow. But also, we, people like you and I, Lynn, are not used to being around free people. We're used to being around people who, they know that if grandma's around, right, like,
Mm.
perform a certain way, and my kids are like, why would I do that? And it's, so if, like, they expect you to hug or to all of, it's like, it's, I don't want a hug. You didn't even ask. And
Right.
then the person looks over at you like, did you hear what your kid said? Because then that's my job. And I'm like, yes, I heard.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's frustrating for adults because it's like, don't, I want them to be free, but not like that. So
Right.
that can be tricky, especially when your kids are younger. Now my girls are taller than me and it's a different thing. But when they were younger, it, yeah, it's tricky.
So shame. It doesn't feel like there would be a lot of shaming going on in your household.
Right. Because we try not to do punishment and reward things, and shame is tied to that, and shame is also oftentimes a byproduct of manipulation. And to be
Mhm.
clear, I'm not saying these things don't happen in our household. I'm saying we're actively practicing recognizing when it's happening, also listening to our daughters, which is the best space because they tell us when it's happening, and that's how we know oftentimes. But
Yeah.
it's been so long that it's not always how we know. Now we know what some of our tendencies are, and
Right.
why we do that, and also have developed things to disruptors to put in place so that we don't default to that thing. So of course, I'm sure there are times where shame comes up, but we have things to work that, and that they feel safe to say when that happened, or we feel safe to say when a violation happened, because it's not, unschooling isn't, I call it the pervasive whiteness idea of unschooling, that it's like freedom means that everyone but you gets pulverized.
Mm.
No, that's not what freedom means. Freedom and responsibility go together.
Right.
Accountability is a part of liberation. So we are constantly learning what that even means, because we didn't grow up in
Yeah.
it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
a lot of that. Yeah.
Can you go a little bit more and maybe give some examples of the disruptor? You said there's ways to disrupt us from going back into that old pattern.
Yeah. Sure. So one of them is just the pause, just to pause, to to question the idea that as the parent or as the teacher or as the adult, your job, when something happens and there's a trigger involved, that your job is to go in and fix the rupture, right? So immediately, one really powerful thing that we often do is to just say, what if I didn't immediately try to fix what's happening? What if I pause? As simple as that may sound, it doesn't sound simple to everybody, I know. But
Mhm.
for as simple as it might sound to some, it is so powerful, because in it is the opportunity to become a witness, to
Hmm.
go from somebody who is wielding a feeling to witnessing. That
Right.
witnessing vantage point over time becomes its own set of muscles that then allows you to offer discernment instead of the protective response. So you intuit, you witness, you learn, you might listen to something, read something, you give yourself the space to develop the tools, so that over time you are no longer like captive to the thing that was built up for you to deal with every time somebody made you feel like this. Turns out this time it's a kid, so what? We don't know, we don't recognize. So that's a disruptor. That the pause is a powerful opportunity, because if you pause from the mindfulness of I am deschooling, I am willing imperfectly, repeatedly, to recognize that I tend to use power over, because oftentimes with this child is the only place that I feel like I have some power, and I'm not going to mess it up here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and to circle back to something you said a little while ago, you were talking about I have some wisdom. I am older. And so it's not just let them do what they want. So what if one of the
Right.
children,
Be irresponsible. Yeah.
yeah. So if someone is, wanting to stay up till 3 in the morning every night gaming, and then they get, we're so vulnerable to the dopamine and all of the things that happen with all kinds of different addictions. So how does that intersect in terms of your wisdom around that?
Yeah, so that answer will vary, of course. So there's no like unschooling formula, because that would be antithetical to unschooling, right? So I
Right.
would say definitely my podcast, as you mentioned, Fear of the Free Child, you'll hear lots of different families talk about it, which is so useful. I
Mhm.
love my podcast. Like, I'm happy to talk about it because I get so much from the conversations. so
Right.
so that's one thing I would say, if somebody's watching this and is like, thank you so much, Lynn, for asking that question, go listen to Fear of the Free Child, because we talk about it all the time. So that is an opportunity to, one, recognize where we're coming from as adults. We are, my friend Zakia Ismail, another unschooling mom, talks about being immigrants and our children being natives, right, to the digital space. So yes, addiction is real. Yes, those things come up. Also, we as adults have our susceptibility to it, also paints, the picture of how we think children are susceptible to it, because I find that my children are more responsible with, like, say, Instagram than I am. I tend to, don't let me get on a good thread, you'll come back and find me in that same spot. And I'm a responsible adult paying bills and things. Yet they will schedule their time, or Sage took it off of her off of her phone completely because she realizes what happens. How did she know that? Because she did it long enough to recognize, because we didn't stop her from spending months at a time to get to the point where it was like, first of all, it makes me anxious about my art, because then I start comparing mine to other people's. And something we told her, or a therapist told her, she experienced it. So
Right.
now she's telling that to her friends. She's on an episode of my podcast saying, is it that your parents are giving you too many things to do, or is it that you actually are not doing enough things that are tied to what you want to do? So then where's yours? She knows that from experience.
Right. Right.
So the thing is not to question the end result that you're so sure of. It's to question whether that's even the end result, and what might be the thing. What's the thing that's actually triggering your fear around it? And give yourself the space to be with that, because maybe it does lead you back to them and 3 a.m. for 5 months, and that's too much. But it will also open you up to some other things too, that
Right.
will allow you to then partner with them to say, can we do a headache chart for the next 2 weeks? Let's see. And you promise to tell me if because what you're building is a trustful environment that they can be honest and say, I have a headache, but I want to do it again tomorrow anyway. And you're going to say, all right, but let's make sure we put it on the chart. And
Right.
that happens over a week. You're going to go back and say, it feels like you're not taking care of yourself. And so it feels like it is my case, this, because that's literally what we do. I
Yeah.
feel like it is for me to step in now because you're not eating at this time. But then I talked to my friend who's into Ayurveda, and she said that people of different doshas actually fast intuitively at times. And it turns out Sage was exactly that dosha in Ayurveda, and she was intuiting something, and it helped her with a stomach issue that she was having, that I didn't even know was happening, because she didn't tell me, because she knew that I would be like, it's because you're not doing these things.
Right.
That's
Right.
another example.
Right. Really down to earth in your life every day. Yeah. And that we don't have to be in these slots. Right. Wow.
Yeah. Anything that comes up as a question of, but how would I get them to understand this, and that I do have wisdom? Remember that in the work of raising free people, you're building a trustful environment. So in a trustful environment, they would know and say and work and discern through, I'm frustrated with what grandma's saying or what mom is saying, but I know from experience that she has my best interest. So maybe it feels, we talk about the sociocratic model, good enough for now, safe enough to try. It's like, okay, we do a lot of that. And then that allows for, well, how was that? Did you die because you took the damn violin class? No? Okay. Or yes, and she's never going to do it again. And I know now because we talked about it, and I'm actually going to let it go, and I'm not going to keep bringing it back up. And then when she asks for the other class, I'm not going to say, well, you didn't do violin, because remember I told, I'm not
Mhm.
going to do that. So
Yeah.
she trusts me to say, actually, what I'm really interested in is football.
If someone's listening to this and they're like, I'm really attracted to this, I could free myself as well as stopping the colonization of my children.
Mhm.
What are their next steps?
Raisingfreepeople.com. That's my site. And there is the link to the podcast, again, which is such a beautiful space to just work through the things that come up when this is on your radar and in your heart. I also have recently opened a Fair of the Free Child Village inside of the Mighty Networks ecosphere,
Oh,
where we are just working through the episodes. So people just decide on an episode that was really, it really allowed them to work the work, and we get together and talk about
oh,
it. um,
great.
yeah, so that and the link to that is on my Instagram. So that's the social media place where I'm really active. It's at Fare of the Free Child, FARE. So I
Mhm.
would say those two spaces, raisingfreepeople.com and Instagram, where I'm just constantly in communication with other people who are living this work and amplifying this work in various ways.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. And I'm just, you know, how when you're really engaged in something like what you do with your children and you do yourself, it just sparks so much and
Exactly.
excitement. It feels so true, and yeah, it feels so real. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation. Again, I love when the everything is everything, as we say back home. I love when things come together and it's like, of course there's a connection because
Yeah.
yeah. So thank you for this.
Well, thank you again, and all the best with your work and with your children, and
Thank you.
you're
Best to you and yours as well. And I really appreciate connecting.
welcome to the 2021 Radical Recovery Summit, presented by the Kiloby Center for Recovery. This is Lynn Fraser, your moderator. This year, our theme is Feel It, Heal It, a new paradigm of recovery, featuring a diverse group of thought leaders and innovators, people who are working on the ground in the new field of addiction recovery. Go to radicalrecoverysummit.com to sign up and watch free.